I remember when I was a kid, one of my history teachers was rebuilding a car. The thing always looked incomplete. Months would go by and there would be no visible signs of progress. This teacher explained that he was rebuilding the car from the inside out. Why didn't he throw some fenders and paint on it? Because that would be the easy part at the end, and the exterior finishes would just get in the way in the meantime. His priority was the internal components. This is the way that Cardano's been built: robust and strong internal components first. And it looks like we're just months away from turning this thing into a fully realized machine. Ready? Let's go. Today, we are going to discuss the results of that European Parliament committee vote, some interesting things from Charles' latest AMA, Colorado accepting crypto for taxes, the ADA handlement, and Pavia yield farming. If you are enjoying these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. It looks like crypto, and specifically proof of work this time, have once again barely escaped regulatory doom. You'll remember from yesterday that the Monetary and Economic Committee of the European Parliament was voting today on some provisions in the MiCA framework, the Markets in Crypto Assets framework. And these provisions would have effectively banned proof of work cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin in the current manifestation of Ethereum. They have voted down that provision, which is a great thing for crypto because all of the large cap cryptos are correlated right now. If Bitcoin were to take a hit as big as being banned in the European Union, there's no way this wouldn't impact all the rest of the large cap cryptocurrencies like Cardano. But in fact, they voted against this provision, and in its place, they entered a pretty seemingly benign provision that basically just says they're asking the European Commission to propose legislation to include crypto asset mining in the EU financial sustainability taxonomy, which would classify the sustainability of these different financial activities. And they want them to suggest this legislation by 2025. So this is a much better outcome for all of the proof of work cryptocurrencies. I think I can't help but see this as a sign of the growing widespread acceptance of cryptocurrencies in general. I don't think if so many Europeans weren't already holding Bitcoin, I could see the members of the European Parliament on this committee, easily voting to get rid of this very highly energy consumptive computer network, in the face of this sort of crippling, lack of ability to import energy like they could before from Russia. So I think this is a good thing. I think only with the widespread adoption of crypto do we see crypto being able to withstand these kind of attempts at, putting us in regulatory peril. So this is a good thing for crypto and a good sign for the widespread adoption we've already seen just of crypto in general. There was also a surprise AMA from Charles today, and like usual, he gives a few updates on what IOHK is building right now before he jumped into the AMA proper section. And today's updates were a lot more on the granular component side. He talked about the little things that Cardano was building. I think over the last couple of years, we've definitely gone through long periods where IOHK was building very, very big things that took a long time to build, and we were in the middle of these big building processes, and we were waiting forever for Shelly, and we were waiting forever for Alonzo, and there were these big giant things that would be these big jumps forward, but would take a really long time to build. And I think now we've gotten to this era where IOHK can kind of build these little components. I would argue they're still in sort of the internal building phase, but these are sort of the last small components. Like always, I hope they're building forever. I hope IOHK is building stuff for Cardano forever, constantly evolving and improving and creating a better and better blockchain for us with all of its many components. But I think now we're in this phase where we've almost got something that looks like a complete machine, but there are a few last little components, little internal components that still need to be built out. And then we'll have the really fancy aesthetic stuff going on too. All of the projects will be built on top of these internal components. But today's AMA, at least the update part of it, was a lot more about a few of these last little internal components that are really kind of required before we hit this period that I think sort of starts after the Vossel hard fork combinator event in June. I think that's the period when we'll start getting a lot of the beautiful front facing external kind of things. So Charles said the Mamba Testnet, a Mamba Testnet of some sort, is supposed to be coming this month. He hasn't talked to the Mamba team in a couple of weeks, but it sounds like, just like last time we talked to him, that the Mamba Testnet is still scheduled for this month. He did say some sort of Mamba Testnet. So what we actually get, we'll see. But I'm glad to hear there's progress on Mamba. He reminded us, if you don't know, that Mamba is the EVM BFT sidechain. EVM is Ethereum virtual machine, and BFT is Byzantine fault tolerance. If you don't know what BFT is, that's a nice little cryptocurrency rabbit hole you can go down. You can learn all about different consensus mechanisms in cryptocurrencies just by Googling that one phrase. On sidechains generally, Charles had some interesting things to say. He said there will actually be economic incentives for ADA holders whenever a sidechain is released. This is interesting because before recently, we've heard him talk about how there would be economic incentives for stake pool operators, and now he's extending that to ADA holders, and it makes sense why it would be both. He says they will use the stake pool operators from the base layer to bootstrap Ouroboros BFT based sidechains. If there are tokens in those side chains, the stake pool operators can get block rewards in these tokens along with their normal ADA rewards from the base layer. And of course, like we've seen on the base layer, the practice has been that in order for a stake pool operation to be viable, they of course need to pass along the vast majority of those stake rewards to the delegators. So if this pattern holds for these side chains, we could see the stake pool operators getting ADA rewards from the base layer, as well as other token rewards in these side chains, and hopefully that's passed along to the delegators. Charles says total value locked is looking phenomenal, given that we've gone from 2 million to over 250 million in a short amount of time, and the vast majority of the projects in Cardano are backloaded toward the Vossel hard fork combinator event. When asked about the EU's near ban of proof of work, Charles pointed out that the Bitcoin people tend to pretend like the energy their blockchain consumes doesn't matter because what BTC does is somehow incomparable to what any other blockchain does. He says this will be a wake-up call for the astute as to the comparability of other consensus mechanisms to proof of work. He also pointed out that the ASIC supply chain is private and patented, and normal people like you and me obviously don't necessarily get first shot at those rigs. If you weren't around sort of during the period when we first saw the rise of ASICs, you might not be aware. The way it works, the mining rigs for proof of work blockchains like Bitcoin are manufactured by a certain number of manufacturers. And historically, back in the old days, they were all centered in China. Of course, things have changed since China sort of booted the mining industry outside of its borders. But back in the old days, it was highly concentrated in China. And these ASICs, as Charles pointed out, these chips are patented and private. And the manufacturers, there was always this implication that the manufacturers of these ASICs were taking the latest generation of ASICs and running them for themselves before they would pass that technology on to outside consumers. So I think there have always been big questions about the egalitarian the truly egalitarian nature or lack thereof in Bitcoin, because the Bitcoin protocol is really controlled by these miners, and the mining was heavily concentrated in one part of the world, and it wasn't even available to everybody, just sort of the parties very close to these manufacturers of these private and patented ASIC machines. Whereas in proof of stake, anyone can buy the coin and participate meaningfully. It's pretty easy for anybody to acquire some Cardano and delegate that Cardano and participate in governance on the Cardano chain. Very difficult to do the same thing in Bitcoin or pretty much any other proof of work blockchain. This next part was pretty interesting. If we're thinking about Cardano being in this phase where it's finishing off some of the really important big internal components before we get all of the fancy public facing aesthetic stuff in a lot of the platform launches that will happen after the Vassal hard fork. So Charles described June as a 1-2 punch with pipelining and input endorsers. This was interesting because he didn't even mention SIP33 and reference scripts, which will obviously be a huge leap forward for alleviating DApp-based congestion. Charles described the interesting part about input endorsers as being that it will move the bottleneck from the consensus mechanism to the actual network stack. And Charles said, this kind of surprised me, Charles said that the throughput, we would then reach throughput levels that would be like being a DAG. These are some, if you're comparing your blockchain's throughput levels to DAGs, you're talking about a giant leap forward in throughput. So I think this is a really good sign. I was thinking about reference scripts as being maybe the most important part of the Vassal hard fork combinator event in June. And that's definitely why a lot of the smart contract based dApp platforms are waiting for June. But it sounds like, in Charles's opinion, that input endorsers might even be the most important thing happening in June. And it kind of makes sense. If the bottleneck in the Cardano throughput is currently sort of centered around the consensus mechanism, if we can move it to the actual network stack, then, as Charles put it, as bandwidth increases, the throughput for the entire network will just organically increase. And it makes sense if everything slowing us down is in the network stack, then all we have to do is upgrade the network stack to improve throughput on Cardano. That sounds pretty good compared to the bottleneck being somewhere around the consensus mechanism. We're in for a very interesting time in Cardano, given that we're already in March and June is only 3 months away, and we've got all these things happening around SIPs 31 through 33, pipelining and input endorsers, and this gigantic leap forward in throughput. And we've also got all of these platforms that are launching, all of these projects that are launching, sort of waiting for that June hard fork. It's going to be really interesting. I really do feel like we've been building this colossal machine, and over the next few months, we're going to be putting the last of the very important internal components in place, and then throwing on all the exterior armor and just turning this thing loose. I think it's going to be a really interesting time in Cardano. In other news related to widespread adoption of crypto, it looks like Colorado will become the first state in the United States to accept crypto payments for tax payments. This is really interesting because this article, at least, focuses on the pragmatic reasons why the governor might have signed this Digital Token Act. And they cite specifically the lack of chargebacks. This has been one of the things we've talked about with crypto since the very, very early days of Bitcoin. How much better is it for anyone accepting payment for anything, usually merchants, but in this case, a government, anyone accepting payments for anything, the worst thing that can happen to them is a chargeback, the money being sort of digitally taken away from them. Ironically, it's the most digital form of payment, crypto, that is actually the one where it can't be digitally clawed back from them. It looks like Colorado sees the value in this. Of course, they're going to be converting all of the crypto into dollars before it's actually deposited in their accounts. He says, we are getting a crypto provider to accept crypto equivalent and deposit the dollars into the state's treasury for that amount. It's kind of like credit card payments with the bonus that there are no returned payments. Definitely nice for anybody accepting payments. I think this is a good sign when a state government at least is accepting crypto as payment for anything, and it's because of actual benefits, not just because somebody got voted into office who's a crypto enthusiast. We are such a ghost chain that ADA handle finally went to public mainnet, and they were able to mint 50,000 ADA handles for a chain apparently engaged mainly in ghosting. That is a very high need for ADA handles. I think the Cardano blockchain is a lot bigger, and the community is way larger than any of our critics could possibly realize. If you're minting an ADA handle in the first couple of days that ADA handles are even publicly available, you're probably pretty deep in the Cardano ecosystem. I mean, these aren't people who randomly saw a crypto coin called Cardano on Coinbase and bought some, never to think about it again. These are people who are pretty deep in Cardano if they even knew that ADA handles were a thing and were available over the last couple of days. And that segment of people bought 50,000 of them. It looks like there will now be yield farming of the Pavia token. I don't think any of us guessed how far this Pavia project would go from that first announcement of the existence of the project and the fact that they were going to be selling some land. I don't think I ever imagined there'd be yield farming of a token issued by Pavia this quick in the process. But I think this is kind of a testament to the interoperability and composability and layering of Cardano projects on top of each other. We definitely see this in other crypto ecosystems, but in Cardano, we're seeing this very early in the process. It didn't take a couple of years for this to happen. All of these projects have existed a small number of months, and they've already achieved such a high level of interoperability. I can't imagine what this thing is going to look like in a couple of years when all these projects have kind of grown these little vines into the layer, every layer of every other project, and this whole thing is just kind of this symbiotic organism that we call Cardano. We'll see how that looks in a couple of years, but in the meantime, I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.